mom had gave me this little glass house, and she said, one day this will be real. And now it finally is.
What are you saying? What are you saying? What is he saying?
For years, Gypsy Rose Blanchard was perceived as a tragic victim, a young woman whose life had been controlled and manipulated by her mother, Dee Blanchard. The story that initially captivated the public painted a heartbreaking picture of a girl who had spent her life confined to a wheelchair, suffering from severe medical conditions, entirely dependent on her mother's care. Gypsy was seen as the ultimate victim of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a rare and deeply disturbing form of child abuse in which a parent fabricates or induces illness in their child to gain sympathy and control. When the truth came out that Dee had lied about Gypsy's health for years and that Gypsy had ultimately conspired to have her mother killed, the world was shocked. People quickly rallied around Gypsy, offering sympathy and support.
Gypsy Rose is spiraling after new shocking evidence is shaking up the case that changes everything you thought you knew 10 years later. According to the latest documents, GRB admits from the age of 6,
believing she had been pushed to an extreme act by the unbearable circumstances she had endured. But as time went on and more details emerged, a troubling question began to surface: was Gypsy truly the innocent, helpless victim the world believed her to be? Or was she far more calculated than anyone initially suspected? From the moment news of the case broke, Gypsy's portrayal in the media was that of a fragile, manipulated young woman who had finally broken free from her mother's suffocating control. The revelation that she could walk was the first major shock to the public, shattering the carefully crafted illusion of her physical frailty. For years, Dee had successfully convinced doctors, neighbors, and even charities that Gypsy was gravely ill.
To her mother about being unable to walk. She claimed that her legs were numb, and she did claim this until 2011, when she was 19 or 20, including she needed the use of a wheelchair.
She was forced to use a wheelchair despite having no physical disabilities, underwent unnecessary medical procedures, and was fed a cocktail of medications that she did not need. The idea that Gypsy had been a prisoner in her own body, trapped in a false identity created by her mother, was both heartbreaking and enraging. However, as the case continued to unravel, inconsistencies in Gypsy's own story began to emerge, raising questions about how much of a passive victim she truly was. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was Gypsy's behavior following her mother's murder. Rather than displaying signs of trauma, fear, or even remorse, she seemed oddly detached. When investigators first questioned her, she attempted to feign ignorance, acting as though she had no idea what had happened.
Over 100 schmexual videos between Nicholas Godejohn and Gypsy have surfaced. There's even more. A Canon camera was found in GRB's backpack upon apprehension.
But as authorities gathered more evidence, it became clear that not only had Gypsy been aware of the plan to kill her mother, but she had been the mastermind behind it. She had manipulated her then-boyfriend, Nicholas Godejohn, into committing the murder, coaxing him into believing that it was the only way for them to be together. The disturbing reality was that Gypsy had been playing a role for years, first as the sickly, helpless girl in public, and then as the frightened victim of an overbearing mother. But in private conversations with Nicholas, a different side of her emerged, one that was calculated, strategic, and fully aware of what she was doing.
This contained a 4G SD card that was never searched. An SD card that may contain crucial evidence and CS photos. Dan Patterson, the district attorney that gave Gypsy Rose a 10-year plea deal, knew that this existed and failed to provide it to Nick Godejohn's defense.
Her manipulation of Nicholas was evident in the way she communicated with him online. Gypsy played into his violent fantasies, feeding into his belief that he was her hero and savior, convincing him that killing Dee was the only solution. She gave him specific instructions, told him when and how to carry out the murder, and ensured that he had a knife to us in the attack. Yet, when confronted by authorities, she quickly distanced herself from him, acting as though she had been coerced into the situation rather than having orchestrated it. One of the most chilling moments came when she casually remarked that if Nicholas had done something stupid, she would have slapped him. This statement, seemingly offhand, revealed a disturbing level of detachment from the crime. Rather than expressing grief or even hesitation about the murder, she was already working to shift blame onto Nicholas.
What do you have?
Cancer, muscular dystrophy. I need glasses. I need hearing aids. Seizure disorder. And I can't remember what else.
Portraying him as the sole aggressor while she played the role of the innocent bystander. The contradictions in Gypsy's behavior did not stop there. When speaking about her mother after the murder, she occasionally showed signs of fondness, referring to DD in ways that suggested their relationship was more complicated than a simple case of abuser and victim. While DD's actions were undoubtedly abusive, Gypsy's responses to her mother's death raised the question of whether she had been a completely unwilling participant in the deception, or if she had, at least in some ways, actively contributed to maintaining the facade. The more authorities dug into Gypsy's past, the more they found that she had been aware of the truth about her own health for much longer than she had initially claimed. Long before she met Nicholas, Gypsy had begun exploring relationships with other men online, proving that she had more agency than many had assumed.
And you figure out that you weren't actually sick.
I started to put together when I was about 19 years old. Then I didn't understand the full extent of how healthy I was until after I got arrested.
Why did you not tell doctors that you knew you could walk or you didn't believe yourself in jail during the time that you were?
I didn't think that anyone would believe me. I thought they would put a chance on my mom, and that would make my whole life even worse for me. I feared her more than I feared anyone else.
One key figure in her past was Dan Glidwell, an ex-boyfriend who had no idea that Gypsy was supposedly sick until much later. She had confided in Dan that she could walk, a revelation that, at the time, seemed minor but later took on much greater significance. This meant that Gypsy had been choosing when to reveal the truth and to whom, selectively deciding how to present herself based on what benefited her in the moment. If she had the ability to make these choices, then how much of her situation had she been actively managing rather than simply enduring? Her ability to fabricate stories was another troubling aspect of her character. Gypsy had spent years lying to doctors, friends, and even extended family members, convincing them that she was sick.
The first time I've been honest, besides being honest, my attorneys, even that, I haven't been completely honest with them.
She had managed to manipulate entire medical teams into believing she needed treatment, showcasing an impressive level of deception. Even after her mother's death, she continued to control the narrative, shifting blame, and constructing a version of events that placed her in the best possible light. Further evidence of Gypsy's manipulative tendencies came out in the way she framed Nicholas after the murder. Despite playing a direct role in planning the crime, she painted herself as a naive, helpless girl who had been swept up in his dangerous influence. In reality,
That is correct. At the time, I was very, very sheltered in my life. And so the avenues in which I cognitively thought to reach out, my mom had told me a lot of lies about my father. And so I didn't turn to him for help because I thought that he didn't love me. That's what my mom led me to believe. I grew up with a mom that basically made me fearful of strangers.
it was Gypsy who had encouraged Nicholas, not the other way around. She had played into his desires, made him feel like a protector, and then discarded him the moment he was no longer useful. This was not the behavior of someone who was simply desperate for freedom. It was the behavior of someone who knew exactly how to get what they wanted while avoiding the consequences. Perhaps one of the most revealing aspects of the case was how easily Gypsy was able to manipulate public perception. Even after being convicted and sent to prison, she remained a media darling, with many still seeing her as a victim rather than a willing participant in a murder. The sympathy she received was understandable, given the horrors she endured at the hands of her mother, but it also obscured a much darker reality. Gypsy was not just a girl who had been trapped in an abusive situation. She was also someone who had learned to manipulate those around her to achieve her own goals.
And so I felt like the only person I could confide in was my co-defendant. And so I wish I would have gone through other avenues. That is a forever lifelong regret. But unfortunately, hindsight's 2020, and so I can't change the past.
Dan could have been a key witness in exposing Gypsy Rose Blanchard's deception. If he had testified, he could have contradicted her carefully crafted image of a fragile, helpless girl who was completely dependent on her mother. Dan knew the truth. Gypsy was not only capable of walking, but was also highly aware of the lies she was telling and skilled at manipulating others into believing them. His testimony would have been a crucial piece of evidence, but it wasn't the only thing that could have shifted the perception of Gypsy's role in the crime. The communication between Gypsy and Dan, particularly the intimate text messages and explicit content they exchanged, revealed a side of her that was far from the innocent victim she portrayed in court. Gypsy didn't just engage in these exchanges passively. She used them to her advantage, manipulating men and shaping relationships in ways that benefited her. One particularly striking instance was when Gypsy sent Dan suggestive pictures, including one where she inappropriately used a toothbrush. This was not the behavior of a naive, submissive girl trapped by her circumstances.
So he calls for Yellow Cab, explaining to me that process there. You guys, Yellow Cab obviously shows up. You can kind of start from there.
And we got into the Yellow Cab, and we told them to go to the hotel.
It was clear evidence of Gypsy's ability to use her sexuality as a tool for control. When Dee Dee discovered Gypsy's relationship with Dan, she attempted to put a stop to it, citing Gypsy's supposed underage status. However, Gypsy pushed back, insisting that she was 18 and even providing documentation to prove it. This wasn't just about asserting her independence. It was about ensuring that she maintained the relationship on her own terms. She had spent years perfecting an image of herself as a weak, vulnerable woman, carefully constructing a narrative that allowed her to appear as the victim in every situation. Her legal defense team leaned into this narrative during the trial, allowing her to continue presenting herself as a powerless figure caught between her abusive mother and a controlling relationship with Nicholas Godejohn. But what the trial failed to fully explore was the reality that Gypsy was far more in control of the situation than she let on. She wasn't just reacting to her circumstances, she was actively shaping them. Rather than being a passive victim in her relationship with Nicholas, Gypsy was the mastermind, orchestrating the entire situation and manipulating him into committing murder on her behalf. This fact was critical in understanding the true nature of the crime, yet it was never fully examined in court. The defense had the opportunity to challenge Gypsy's version of events and present an alternative narrative, one that painted her not as a powerless pawn, but as the dominant force in her relationship with Nicholas.
He only paid her his name, and I was able to sneak in the room with him.
So explain that to me. How did you sneak in the room? Were you over by Waffle House or something? Or did you get in the room?
I stayed right outside.
Outside?
Like the office, right in the
Outside the hotel? Okay.
Instead of allowing Gypsy to frame herself as the one being manipulated, the defense could have used evidence to demonstrate how she actively used Nicholas as a tool to achieve her goal. She wasn't the innocent, defenseless woman she appeared to be in court. She was the architect of her own escape, deliberately pulling Nicholas into her web of lies and coercing him into action. Had the defense taken a more aggressive approach in cross-examining Gypsy's testimony, they could have exposed the depth of her manipulations and shown that she was far more culpable in Dee Dee's murder than the jury had been led to believe. Their failure to challenge Gypsy's narrative allowed her to dominate the courtroom, leaving the jury with an incomplete understanding of the relationship between her and Nicholas. By neglecting to highlight the power dynamics at play where Gypsy was the one calling the shots, the defense missed a crucial opportunity to shift the perception of the case. The jury was ultimately left with a distorted version of events, one where Nicholas was painted as the mastermind and Gypsy as the helpless, coerced victim. Had the defense introduced the full extent of Gypsy's manipulations, it might have altered the trajectory of the case, leading the jury to reconsider who was truly in control. Instead, Gypsy's carefully crafted image of vulnerability remained unchallenged, allowing her to escape full accountability for her role in the crime. Another pivotal moment in the trial came when forensic psychologist Dr. Ken Franks testified about Nicholas Godejohn's diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, level 2, with intellectual impairment.
Where did you guys go after that?
It's Waffle House. We tried to eat cracker about it, and I started getting some chocolate milk because I got sick.
Okay. All right. So you ate at the Waffle House, right next to the Days Inn, in the same parking lot. Okay. And where did you go after you guys ate?
We went to the hotel today.
This was a critical piece of evidence, as it provided insight into why Nicholas was so easily influenced by Gypsy. However, while this diagnosis was significant, the defense failed to assess it effectively. Instead of delving deeper into how Gypsy had preyed on Nicholas's vulnerabilities, they allowed the prosecution to paint him as the sole instigator of the crime. In reality, Nicholas's cognitive and social impairments made him an ideal target for Gypsy's manipulation. She knew exactly how to exploit his weaknesses, how to make him feel needed, and how to coerce him into carrying out her plan. Gypsy's manipulation extended far beyond simple persuasion. She meticulously groomed Nicholas, using intimate text messages, videos, and shared fantasies to create an illusion that he was her hero. She fed him a narrative in which she was the victim in desperate need of rescue, making him believe that killing DD was not only justified but necessary. Yet, the defense failed to fully present this evidence, leaving the jury with the false impression that Nicholas acted out of his own free will. They did not see the complete picture of how Gypsy had carefully constructed her web of lies, trapping Nicholas within it. This critical omission allowed the prosecution to cast Nicholas as the true villain while obscuring the extent of Gypsy's involvement. Had the defense highlighted the text messages, the evidence of grooming, and the psychological manipulation at play, the jury might have reached a very different conclusion about Nicholas's culpability.
So you guys lay down. Approximately how long did you guys sleep?
Probably about 5 hours.
About 5 hours. Okay. After you slept 5 hours, then what did you guys do? Did you end up going anywhere?
We stayed at the hotel the whole time.
So,
Instead, the trial only presented a partial view of the events leading to DD's murder, with Gypsy's role largely downplayed. This failure to examine the deeper psychological aspects of the case left a significant gap in the trial, one that could have dramatically altered its outcome. By neglecting to expose the full extent of Gypsy's manipulations, the defense not only failed to protect Nicholas, but also allowed Gypsy's deception to remain hidden. Looking at the aftermath of the case, it's impossible to ignore the stark contrast in how Gypsy and Nicholas have been treated. Despite her undeniable role in orchestrating DD's murder, Gypsy has, in many ways, been elevated to the status of a victim. In interviews, she has claimed that the events of that night are behind her, as if it were just a single, unfortunate moment in her life, something she has since moved on from. But can we truly move on when the person responsible for setting everything in motion is free while the one she manipulated remains imprisoned? Gypsy's continued freedom, coupled with her lack of accountability, raises troubling questions about who has truly benefited from this crime. She has managed to turn her story into a source of public sympathy, capitalizing on the narrative of abuse while downplaying her own involvement in her mother's murder. She has even gone so far as to mock Nicholas, calling him a psychopath, despite overwhelming evidence that she was the one who masterminded the crime while he was merely the tool she used to carry it out. In her ongoing efforts to control the public perception of her story, Gypsy has found ways to profit both financially and emotionally from the crime. Meanwhile, Nicholas, a man with intellectual impairments, remains behind bars, serving as the scapegoat for a murder he was manipulated into committing. Gypsy has masterfully controlled the narrative, ensuring that the focus remains on a version of events that serves her interests, one that is only partially rooted in the truth. Meanwhile, Nicholas remains in prison, his life permanently altered by the choices of someone else. It's hard to grasp the level of frustration and emotional turmoil he must be experiencing, knowing he was manipulated so completely. He is serving time for a crime that was, in many ways, orchestrated by Gypsy, a cruel twist of fate in which an intellectually vulnerable man shoulders the full blame for something he likely never would have done on his own. But Gypsy's actions didn't end with her mother's death. Instead, they set off a ripple effect, altering two lives forever, one lost, the other imprisoned. And yet, while Nicholas continues to serve his sentence, Gypsy has moved forward, free to craft a new life for herself, protected by a narrative that has largely shielded her from deeper scrutiny. This imbalance raises a fundamental question. Can we simply accept this outcome and move on? Are we comfortable knowing that one life was taken and another ruined because of one person's deception? The answer is far from straightforward. This case isn't just about a single tragedy. It's about whether justice has truly been served for both individuals involved. Gypsy has found a way to reclaim her life, using public sympathy and media attention to her advantage, while Nicholas remains behind bars for his role in the crime. But is this truly justice? With new documents emerging that contradict much of what we've been told, perhaps it's time to take a closer look at the story we've been led to believe. These revelations could finally provide long-overdue answers, ones that may allow Nicholas the opportunity to seek justice and expose the gaps in the widely accepted version of events. The truth may still have a chance to come to light. If this new evidence highlights critical details that were ignored, it could dismantle the misleading narrative that has endured for so long. True justice is not just about punishment. It's about ensuring that accountability is shared where it rightfully belongs. As we wrap up today's investigation into the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Nicholas Godejohn, I leave you with a question. Should Gypsy be allowed to live her life without further consequence, or should we start questioning everything we've been led to believe? The public's perception of this case has been shaped by Gypsy's ability to portray herself as the victim, shifting responsibility onto Nicholas, the one who remains locked away. But as more information comes to light, it's becoming increasingly clear that the story we've been given might not be the full truth. We now know that the justice system may have overlooked key evidence and failed to fully examine critical witnesses during the trial. Could it be that Gypsy, despite her carefully curated image, has managed to avoid the accountability she deserves? This case is more than just a crime. It's a glaring example of how justice can fail. 2 lives have been permanently altered, one ended, the other confined to a prison cell, and yet, we are still left questioning whether we know the whole story. What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. This investigation is far from over. In our next video, we'll dive even deeper into the evidence that could completely change how we understand this case. Make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because the truth may be closer than we think. Stay with us.